is early, and so I appreciate everybody being here for this informal industry and academy roundtable talking about the museums of the future. So this is very much meant to be an informal kind of discussion-based, hour-long start of a conversation. So we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, for audience questions. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions. We're recording this also, and it's a live stream webinar, so we may have some questions from the virtual world. And certainly after the fact, you can watch it and share it with all your friends on social media. So we'll get started here. I'd like to introduce everybody in just a moment, but first I do want to thank all of the different divisions that have made this event happen so quickly, including the CSU Entertainment Alliance, who's been helpful with promotions, and certainly the entire College of LCA was really supportive in helping this project come together so quickly, and also the music department for letting us use their beautiful space. Thanks very much to Barbara Miller, who's from the Museum of the Moving Image down here at the end, and Jonathan Haim, who's from the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, for coming in. I know it's 3 hours ahead in New York where you are, so it's about lunchtime. And Paige Bardolph, who's right next to them from the Global Museum here at SF State, and Emily Beitiks from the Longmore Institute on Disability here at San Francisco State, Rosa Park, who's also new faculty, just like me, from cinema. Thanks for coming today, Rosa. And Sami Reist from the, sorry, my mind, I saw Becca and then in my head was translating it into broadcast and electronic communication arts. She heads up that
well done,
program.
Well done.
Thank you very much. And Ed Luby, who runs the Museum Studies program here at SF State. And I'm Elizabeth Hunter, and I'm in theater studies. And so delighted to be here with you today. So the way this is going to run is that everybody on the panel around the idea of museums of the future has contributed a question or a provocation, something that is a conversation starter of the kinds of questions we should be thinking about as we think about museum and library and archiving and collecting practices moving from this point into the future. And so I'll introduce those kinds of questions and provocations, and then let that person expand on what they meant, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion for a few minutes about those concepts. So I thought we would maybe start with Barbara's question, which is how can a material culture collection balance the presentation of objects with interactive media experiences?
Yeah, I posed that question because I thought you guys would help answer it for me, because I'm really struggling with that at the moment. So I work at Museum of the Moving Image, and we have this sort of particular challenge in a way, because we are a material culture collection, and that we collect sort of everything related to the production, promotion, exhibition of moving images. It's a giant subject. We have technical apparatus of all kinds, and costumes, and design material, and fan response material, and all kinds of things. But our subject matter, obviously, comes to you through screens. So that is also sort of the primary document of the kinds of things we're exploring. And we obviously want to present a lot of moving image material in our galleries, but how do you sort of balance and retain the kind of encounter with material culture objects in a museum setting while also presenting moving image content, which is something that we feel like we've sort of have a handle on. We've been doing it for about 30 some odd years since we opened, but also with interactive experiences, and with the sort of like with social media kind of like seeping into museum spaces. How do you sort of manage all of those experiences while keeping some kind of encounter with objects present? So that is I don't pretend to have any answers about that, and it's something that we're really thinking about very, very very systematically and very consciously right now, we are in the midst of rethinking our core exhibition, where we present, let's say, 1% or so of our collection of about 130,000 objects in a core exhibit that tells our story. It's an exhibition that's been in place for about 30 years. The narrative has been in place for 30 years. We do rotate the objects, but the narrative has been in place for a long time, and we're kind of starting from scratch because our subject matter has moved on. So we're really imagining a blank slate, and we're excited to incorporate a lot of new approaches in museology that have come up, and there's so much more interactive opportunity that's out there, but sort of how do we do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm the viewer? Because I find, unfortunately, in a lot of museum experiences that I have lately, you're sort of bombarded, right? And I don't know that really serves anybody. So there's a lot of other topics that I'm particularly interested in hearing you guys talk about, it, especially in the realm of digital preservation, because that is something that we're also doing at MOMI. But I will, I'm sorry if I didn't answer my question. I sort of elaborated on the fact that I have this question, and hopefully we can get to talk about it as the day goes on.
This actually makes me think of Ed's question, that maybe we can put the both of them out there, and then folks can kind of brainstorm and grab the mic when you feel like you have, if not an answer to the question. Another part of the question that we should be thinking about, that Ed asked, in what ways does technology enhance, create, or undermine the need to interact with an authentic, real object?
Yeah, so really excited to be here today as part of this. And one of the things we do in museum studies is our goal is to train and produce self-reflective practitioners who have lifelong learning skills in order to be able to respond to changing circumstances. Museums are changing so rapidly, and this is a prime example of it, the place of objects. And I think the ability for our students to have critical abilities to respond to these changes is something we're acutely aware of in how we go about structuring our curriculum and training them. When it comes to objects, I want us to think for a moment about some of our encounters with objects in museums. We, as museum professionals, sometimes can feel separated from the objects, I think, as much as we spend our time with them. And we really want to be thinking about how a visitor interacts with them, and always putting that as a primary way of trying to structure an encounter. And I think for me, going to a museum and looking at an object still, I will have quite often a reaction to an object that can be strongly emotional. It can be provocative. It can make me think about something in a different way. It can be an encounter that is really striking and one that alters how I think about things. And that is such a powerful thing for us to be thinking about. So how can we enhance that? How can we deepen it? How can we preserve that with the changes that are taking place in terms of technology? Technology, I think, can certainly enhance that, but I think we want to be self-reflective in the way that Barbara is saying about how we can do that in a way that builds on our audiences and their needs. And I'm especially struck by how much I've learned about accessibility in the last several years as well, and how difficult it is to balance sometimes all of the needs of our visitors in ways that serve them the best and give them a learning experience, which is what we're after at the end of the day in the museum.
And I can add a little more to that as well. For both Ed and Barbara's questions, is that I think it always circles back to that issue of preservation versus access. And for so long in the museum field, museums were very hands-off. You really only ever handled an object when it was absolutely necessary. There was never really any opportunity for visitors to engage hands-on with objects. And even thinking about that from a digital perspective, one of our recent graduate students wrote a thesis about how museums what things museum collection staff should be thinking about when they're producing videos of their collections, because now it's becoming more and more popular to have things like the Curiosity Show or the American Museum of Natural History Shelf Life, for example. So how do we balance being able to bridge the public with that content who might never otherwise come to the museum, but also still making sure that we're following proper collections protocols? So I think letting go a little bit of the preservation while still being proper stewards in favor of access is something that's only been serving museums more and more, both with technology, also working with community members, accessibility. So we always kind of try to strike that balance in a way that's going to serve our audience, because if our objects are always just in our collection storage and never seen and never used, then it sort of raises the question of why are we the stewards of that material?
I actually have a response both to your question and yours. So my case study that I was going to talk about from a different element is from some experiences I had in a museum-like setting. I wouldn't call them museums, but I had for several years, 10 years ago, I was teaching a class in a virtual world, and what we did in this virtual world was build educational displays. So they were interactive educational displays that taught about the environment. And the goal was for my students, they were the creators, but they were also, because we're in a real virtual world, people from all over the world, there were 1 million users in this world, could come and see their displays. And they created interactive games and things to draw people in and interact. And it meant that people who didn't have easy access could get there, although on the other hand, they had to have access to 3D technology. So it was a social justice issue, really, because not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the technology to create an avatar and run around in a virtual world. And I thought it was very interesting because they really did get engaged with these games and what have you, but at the same time, we were, in a way, the students were orchestrating that awe that you were talking about, that moment. Instead of them coming up and looking at a display and having a reaction, we were asking questions that got them to go to a spot. And so there's a good side to it, I think, and a bad side. But the technologies, and that was 10 years ago. The technologies have improved tremendously since then. But the problems associated with the technologies have also increased, I think.
I think it's an interesting question for museum studies revolving around, thank you very much, revolving around this notion of the thing itself and the authentic original object. Harvey Young talks about this and the removal of an actual noose from a lynching from a museum because it was a controversial piece, and he talks about how that was such a loss for understanding that moment of history. But I wonder, with new technology that is allowing repair and restoration and replica with such fidelity that it can be difficult to distinguish from the thing itself, except for experts. How these questions of improving or increasing accessibility to an object, like where do we draw the line between replica, the thing itself, access, watching, kind of putting on a headset of the Louvre, and then does that increase or not increase footfall to organizations? How have folks thought about that in their institutions?
Thanks. So I'll come right back to that, but I wanted to mention that I'm a curator in a archives and a public library that also has multiple exhibition spaces. I'm responsible for programming and curating exhibitions. So to some extent, having a museum and an exhibition space situated in a publicly accessible archive negates some of the surface issues of this. And by that I mean we're typically, our exhibitions have a mandate to exhibit our permanent materials. our permanent holdings. So what that means for you, if you were to come and see an exhibition and you'd see our objects and our materials on display, those are also materials that for the most part, when they're not on exhibition, you are actually permitted and encouraged to handle by way of a by way of a researcher. Those are, there's certainly a dominance of paper and paper-like and book-like materials, but the range of things we collect is vast. There's, artwork, pieces of technology, costumes, you name it. So we have different points of access for different types of materials, but we often exhibit things with the idea that people can in fact handle and use them later. It might be more mediated by a person. We do protect the materials with surrogates and digital copies, but there is always an avenue to work with the original object. So that's not so much a solution to something, but it is a way of forward if there are ways to open up collections that might otherwise be available for research. So if there's a museum that has a collection of, let's say, paintings, whatever the apparatus is that would allow the staff or the curatorial staff to work with those, that might be the kind of thing that can be expanded. I'll give you one example of something I worked on a few years ago. One of, and this is interesting, it's like a classic sort of, great white European male, but we had a contractual mandate to do an exhibition around the 150th anniversary of the great conductor Arturo Toscanini, whose materials we take care of at the library. We had done a number of exhibitions that were somewhat traditional in the past, and I wanted to do something new. So at the New York Public Library, we're in the middle of a mass digitization of our audio and moving image materials. We're nearly through several 100,000 pieces of magnetic and optical media that's been digitized, moving on to sort of grooved formats and film and other things now. But this has been going on for a few years, and a choice I made in developing the Toscanini exhibit was to feature Toscanini's legacy as a recording artist. He was an individual who was born slightly before the invention of the light bulb and died having been on television. And that seemed like a really interesting arc, not to mention 2 world wars and a general universal fame for being this wonderful artist. It just raised a lot of things to explore. But I thought I wanted to explore his role as a recording artist because we were very much involved with digitizing. He's someone who cycled through, although he didn't record on wax cylinders that we know of, he cycled through every media format up through the 50s, so that got him to the LP. But that was at least 4 different media formats that he had commercial success with. So what I chose to do was to feature the process itself of how we were digitizing, what we did with the materials. So we actually displayed some of the original equipment, and then we created videos of our preservation engineers actually transferring, showing people how we changed migrated the materials, and took it from there. And then I also set up a station within the exhibition where some of our staff were doing some of the intellectual control over these materials, so that while people were working, and not all of my colleagues were into this, but but while people were working, people in the exhibit could come in and ask them questions about how they worked. It's looking at dozens of spreadsheets and reams of metadata isn't that interesting necessarily, right? But if there's somebody there explaining to you what all of these lines of digits and information mean, it did change the way people thought. So then we had a digital copy of a now an outmoded media, and people then started to understand that yes, it's a replicate, but it's also not when you look at kind of the guts of what that replication was. So being self-referential with your own technological kinds of things, or at least that was my experience, opened up a lot of doors, not only just for people thinking about these things, but also helping them understand how much work gets done behind the scene to sustain these collections in a way that makes them seem permanent when in fact they're constantly changing. So that's just some 2 cents there.
I just want to jump in just for one quick second and say I really appreciate that description, and I think it sort of speaks in really broad terms to one of the major themes we're talking about today, which is, the future of museums, right? And there's a huge sort of movement over the past few decades towards sort of increased accountability of museums to sort of local and global, communities, and accessibility, with a capital A, like meaning all kinds of things. And I think that those methods of self-referentiality and sort of like laying the practices bare help for a lot of reasons, some of which you talked about, but also just in the simplest terms, just making sort of pulling aside the curtain in a way, so that you see what's going on in the back, and demystifying the museum, because I feel like in a lot of ways museums can still be places that you feel like you have to speak really quietly, yes, and that your behavior and your body is being controlled, and all of these things. So like making that division sort of less obvious, I think helps all of us as practitioners and us as the public.
I just add two quick comments. One is what you mentioned is true. It's if you've ever been in a museum with a child, for example, often the kids aren't they may be interested in what's on display, but often they're interested in the really cool staircase that's taking them there, or the arches. And it's the same idea, that being self-aware of your own role in that, in what your mission is extraordinarily interesting, and it also adds a level of transparency and accountability sometimes. The other thing I did want to mention about focusing, in the case of Toscanini, it also was a way to not sidestep, but give some real alternative to approaching a very traditional figure and all of the historical baggage that comes with that, by saying, you know what, you don't have to like this person, you don't have to like what they represent, you don't have to be interested in it. I mean, you can be all of those things, of course, that was there for you, but you could approach what would maybe a seemingly antiquated figure through a completely different avenue, through an avenue of technology or an avenue of thinking about other things, and get something out of that display and exhibition that maybe had nothing to do on the surface with in this case, the individual who was receiving the focus.
I think that's such an important way of not only showing the process behind exhibition creation, but also thinking about these larger questions that Paige actually brought up. That how are museums expanding decolonizing practices and increasing diversity, accessibility, and inclusivity?
Great. Well, I can certainly speak to that, but I hope a few others will as well. And I think that one of the words that Jonathan brought up is transparency. And that's really important, because we need to be a little bit better about sharing with our public what we're doing, whether that's posting information on our website or having it more available in an exhibition. But there's been a huge cultural shift in museums. Certainly over the past century, there's a long history of museums that's not always positive. But really, I would say even in just the past 10 years, both at Luby and I, when we teach in our museum studies classes, we always share a wealth of professional resources, such as the American Alliance of Museums, for example. And I think about the fact that when I was in the museum studies program about a decade ago, some of the topics that we're teaching our students now didn't exist yet. The AAM formed an LGBTQ alliance network in 2014, for example. So, that's only been within the past 5 years. These are all huge subjects. Decolonizing practices have made huge leaps and bounds. That's something we both work a lot with community members, but just those terms, or not terms necessarily, but just those ideas of increasing inclusivity, making visitors feel welcome, even subtle things like changes in membership language could have a huge difference. Not everyone is a family that's going to buy a package to come to the museum. That's 2 adults and 2 children. So we're seeing a lot more of that.
Paige, could you briefly, for folks who might not know what decolonizing practices in a museum are, could you give a kind of overview of what that might be?
Sure. So, museums in themselves are colonial institutions throughout their history. A lot of our collections, particularly ones of material culture, anthropological collections, may have been obtained from communities without the perspective or the permission of that community. And so really only in the past, I would say, couple of decades, really starting in 1990 with the passage of the big repatriation law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that museums have started to think about where do these objects originate from, who were the source communities, who created them, the relationships we have with them, and really engaging with the makers and the ancestors and the people who these objects originally came from. And Ed, if you want to add anything else to that about decolonizing practice.
Thank you. No, that's great.
Sure.
And I think that the question of accessibility and what that means and how we can use these new technologies, not only in terms of rethinking practices, but also in terms of creating physical structures. I mean, I think Emily's question about which I'm going to find right here. In what ways can new technology create more barriers to participation rather than improve accessibility is a really important jumping off point.
Yeah, so when my organization was developing an exhibit, the first thing we did was assemble, it was an exhibit focused on disability history. We knew the overwhelming majority of our visitors were going to be people with disabilities, so we just assembled a charrette and wanted to hear stories. And I mean, it was just so clear that museums were a space that people had basically given up on. They were just institutions of exclusion for everything that you mentioned. They're spaces where, the second you enter, your body's supposed to act a certain way. It's supposed to make no noises, and not to mention just a lot of physical barriers. And so since we built that exhibit, we've since been partnering with various museums throughout the Bay Area. And a lot of times all the hope is around like what new technologies are going to bring, or what's holding them back is sort of images of like all the major sort of barriers they have. And what we've learned at some of them is, that people are like, yeah, well, I mean, you could definitely be doing this better, but first and foremost, we just want you to train your staff. We just want like less microaggressions in these spaces where we feel like we're not supposed to be here. So I think there's really a history when it comes to disability and technology, where we use disability to tell stories about the technology that make us feel better about what technology is going to bring. It's going to help all of our access problems. And sort of conversely, we tell a lot of disability or technology stories about disability, so we can think, oh, we don't have to change as a society. We can leave it to the individual to use technology to adapt. And so at the same moment that technology does have huge potential to make these spaces more accessible, I mean, the fact when our exhibit opened, we were able to do a Zoom presentation for people who are lying in their beds, and that's how they were able to encounter an exhibit, was through Zoom, being able to like be walked through feature through feature. So kind of tying in with that, does the physical object matter? Well, certainly not when you're not even going to enter the space. But a lot of the new apps that I'm seeing museums develop, the very last stage is their access person goes, what? You went with a platform that's not even accessible? So it just continues to be this. It can be an amazing, democratizing opportunity, but also way too frequently disability is an afterthought, and so the technology does more harm than good.
So to shift gears just a little bit, at the same time that I think the spaces of museums and the practices are changing, there's also an interesting conversation around how these kinds of spaces are showcasing, making a collecting priority, or preserving forms of art outside of, kind of what we can hold in our hands. And this gets to the heart of, or Rosa's question gets to the heart of this, about how are museums facilitating, exhibiting, and preserving emerging forms of digital art?
Yes, I came up with this question based on my own experience. I'm a working sound designer and performer, and a lot of my work are based on this performance and one-time ephemeral, experience for the audience. So a lot of time I submitted my application to galleries and museums, and a lot of time it was rejected because what they told me was one of the things it's not really fit to their space, and also they can't really archive or document my work after that. And then one thing I learned from my own experience was we have this technology, and technology with this interactivity and virtual reality, augmented reality, they're just coming into the gallery, but we still have this, like, I would say, conservative barriers that the artists are experiencing with. So I started to look at the, how do I make my, how do I engage with this notion of gallery, try to collect and preserve and document their work in a more efficient way. So I started thinking about a lot of new media art is difficult to preserve and save from the curators and gallery people. And so especially the media art is related to software and device that rapidly become obsolete. So I wanted to think about, if there's any ways to keep those resources, the one-time experience resources in galleries and museums, and what efforts has been made to address those questions. A lot of things going on in my head, so I wasn't really articulating, but some questions I wanted to bring up.
It's funny because it sort of brings us back to one of the first things we were talking about, which was an encounter with the object, the authentic object. Well, what happens when the object is made up of bytes, right? Like stepping away from, material culture being something that you can touch with your hands, and what happens when those things are either recording a performance, or in our case at MoMI, objects that typically were made by hand are now being made digitally and never finding paper. So, it's a huge thing. And, again, to the sort of broader topic of, the museums of the future, or the future of museums, which are two sort of different things. If we as MoMI, as our institution, if we hadn't started sort of gearing up to deal with the fact that these things that we collect already, right, or already in our collecting scope, are now being made digitally, and figuring out how to collect them and preserve them, but also how to exhibit them, right? Then we're sort of like putting ourselves out of business. I mean, it's what it is now, right? So we collect costume design material, production design material, and it's all being made in Photoshop now, or other platforms. So what does that mean for us as an institution? And we're taking. We're not just worrying about it. I mean, we are worried about it, but we're taking steps like a lot of museums are. And what's funny is, when talking to colleagues about this, like, sort of, what do you do about, collecting and preserving and sort of managing digital collections when you're sort of accustomed to doing the same for material culture collections? Like, I think everyone in every institution is worried that all of their colleagues already have it figured out, and they're the ones behind the curve. But then when you start talking to people, you realize everyone's freaking out and doesn't really have the answer, which is in some ways comforting, in some ways not, right? But so we're putting together, trying to put together an infrastructure to be able to manage this. But it's like yet one more thing for a strapped, nonprofit to have to do. And some of the worry is that doesn't get done particularly well, and then what happens to our cultural heritage, right? So all of these things being made so quickly on these digital platforms, and we're trained to be stewards of these objects and to put things nicely in boxes and label them and have, climate controlled storage. And then like all of a sudden, like we're like have to have this whole other skill set, which is like really, really, really different kind of skill set, and how to sort of build these virtual vaults to maintain some of the same types of material that are made completely differently. So it's a million questions about how to do that, and we're like, it's in our face right now, right? Because we're not a film or television archive. We are a material culture collection, but a lot of that same stuff is being made digitally. So we're like right on the front lines trying to figure out how to meet that challenge so that we can continue to collect and preserve and tell the same kinds of stories that we're telling. It's really, really challenging.
I just want to build on that a second. I think if we, in museums, think more about learning and experiences, it helps us take the object off the pedestal it's on sometimes. At the same time, though, we have to really acknowledge that the museum and its relationship with the object and its need to preserve it and cultural heritage is unique. So moving forward, we need to figure out a way to balance those things. And I think there's room for a diversity of approaches where we can have learning experiences that don't necessarily involve our traditional vision of what an object should be in all the ways that we're saying right here. But if we keep our eye on the learning part, I feel like that's one way forward. What are we learning from this? What is our aesthetic appreciation? What are our educational goals? That can also sometimes offer some clarity into our discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Sami, this seems to point directly to what you were thinking about, which is I hope this will be the title of a paper someday, of platforms and codecs and files, oh my, of really getting into the nitty-gritty of the tools that we're using to do these practices.
Yeah, so one of my big challenges as someone who works with students in digital media is that file management could be one of the more dull topics you could possibly introduce into a classroom. Students are not, they don't care about file management, they just want things to happen, and we need to teach these things to students. And they become incredibly important in terms of understanding what do we mean by permanent, for one thing? The department just won a significant award over the summer, and we had to put together a video about our history. And it turned out that an awful lot of not just the digital, but the analog productions that had been done over the past 50 years were in formats that, given the time frame that we had, could not be accessed for this piece that we were putting together. Yes, we had them, they were physically sitting there, there was an object, but they weren't easily usable. So understanding how your files move forward is really, really important. And the metaphor that I often use with my students is, if your iPhone gets an update, you may not be able to run some of your apps because they're no longer compatible with this version of the update. And some of the people who made those apps have gotten frustrated and are not making a new version of the app that runs with your iPhone. Everyone's had that experience at this point. Well, when these are your major works of art, it can be a real problem. How do you keep your creative work moving forward through the different iterations so that it's accessible again? The world that I was talking about that I taught in for several years, in March, and that note is important, or that month is important if you've ever been on a semester system, we call that mid-semester. In March 2010, the virtual world gave us 1 week's notice that they were shutting down. So mid-semester, boom, we're shutting down. And they actually did allow us to keep some of our stuff for a little while. But we literally were up 36 hours straight, desperately trying to take videos of our different people interacting with the displays that we'd made, playing the games we'd created. We took pictures of everything. But those videos, by the way, were in QuickTime. How many of you can play QuickTime files right now? So there's this constant change in terms of what's available and how you can get students. This is really a place where I think a lot of our students will be working, figuring out how to keep the cultural processes moving forward and accessible. But there's always issues of what platforms are accessible, who can access them, and how long are they going to last? And this was a small virtual world. There was only 1 million some users on it. But even Google shuts things down just with next to no notice. And when it's gone, it's gone. So figuring out ways to help these objects persist at least a little bit, I think is really important. And training students to focus, from my perspective, when I do a class like this, they're way more interested in trying to figure out how to get that object to float in the air than they really are in terms of what am I communicating by having an object float in the air. How am I thinking about how to put this display together in a way that will communicate ideas to people? So I have to try and constantly bring them back. Okay, well, this is this platform. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to use it in other ways? And more, I'm really working on trying to do things across different platforms so that there's access from different ways in. But the lack of persistence, we had 4 years ago, we had someone from the Library of Congress who was an archivist come and talk to the department specifically about television and radio, sound kinds of files, and how they're being preserved. And he essentially said, okay, well, we're doing the best we can, but none of the storage media are particularly safe. And so we're digitizing all these things, and we're creating amazing works in these wonderful platforms, but permanence, I think, is a really hard, almost impossible thing to achieve at this point. So what does that mean? That may not be a bad thing. It could be actually bring you more into the moment, but it's certainly something I think that we need to address and consider.
Yeah. So I think as we're coming towards our last 15 minutes here, to kind of wrap up the themes that seem like they're populating this space, and then leave some time for the folks in the audience or any Zoom questions that have come through. It sounds like common ground is in how can we use storytelling to either storytelling of making an exhibit, or the storytelling of how objects came to be here, and preserving stories seems to be something that is running through this conversation. And also the notion of new practices and questions that will inform the museum space going forward, and certainly for a university like San Francisco State, how that goes into the classroom for our students. So this was my provocation. How can our students get a museum job? Because it seems like there are a lot of points of entry, because there's so much need for different perspectives in moving these questions forward. And Sami, I especially like the way you've highlighted the maybe less flashy importance of the future is digital asset management. The burgeoning field of digital asset management will be extremely marketable going forward. So where are these other spaces that we can see that are a job students can envision and then work towards to start solving some of these problems?
Well, that comes to me, I think, being the museum studies person. Museum studies used to be a field that was very disciplinary specific. So in order to come into the museum profession, you needed to be someone who knew history degree, an anthropology degree, or art history. And we've seen that change completely in the last 10 years. We need people with backgrounds and skill sets that are much more diverse than that. We need people who have strong content in their area, but in our program, we are seeking people with those traditional backgrounds, but as well as people in communications who understand digital assets, who are really involved in a whole wide range of things in the academy, because that is what the job market needs right now. It needs people who are able to understand technology, but they also still need to understand the origins of the museum, how it's developed. We heard even today, hearing so much about understanding the history of interactions with disabled groups, understanding interactions with indigenous groups informs our practices today. So our challenge in the museum field is to integrate all of these things and to turn out a whole student. And how do we do that? By getting them in an internship. Internships are absolutely key for us. We have students who come into the program with specific interests. They're in our classes. Those change a little bit. But the power of being in an internship and developing a mentor relationship is really key. And it's exposing them to different kinds of practice that, frankly, can be hard for us to keep up with in the classroom all the time.
And I'll add too, I think that there are some broader skill sets that, regardless of your specialization in the museum field, are really helpful to have. One of them is writing. Being a strong writer is huge. That's something that we really emphasize in the Museum Studies program here. Communication skills, public speaking skills, also really helpful. You may think, I'm a registrar, I'm going into this really awesome new position of digital data management, so I never have to talk to anyone again. That's not necessarily going to be the case. You might be leading a collections tour to a donor, something like that. So of course, communication skills is key. Teamwork, the ability to work well with a team. That's why we have so many collaborative projects, not only within the museum and the program, but also with our colleagues here at the university that we're looking forward to do more. And I think being open to new ideas and open to change, because that's something too that hasn't necessarily been the case in previous generations of museum professionals. Embracing that possibility of maybe handling an object a little more than you would have in the past, so it can be digitized or it can be used in ceremony by a community member. Thinking about fresh perspectives on exhibits, like you mentioned, bringing in that new exhibit about, I can't remember the name of the Italian, Toscanini, exactly. And I think thinking about positions that may have not even existed 10 years ago, now there's a lot of positions for things like social media coordinator or a lot of digital efforts, as we just talked about. So I think a lot of people go into museum studies thinking, I definitely want to be a registrar or I definitely want to be a museum educator, but there are a lot of different types of positions out there. So using that broad skill set, but also getting an interdisciplinary experience where you can draw from other skills will help serve some of these positions that maybe 10 years from now don't even exist yet. So.
I think also another really important issue when we get to the storytelling element is who gets to tell those stories. And so many of the stories in museums are coming from educated white perspective, frankly. And I think that's branching out, but I think one of the things our students can learn to do is go into communities that they haven't been in before. Stretch themselves, talk to people, because communication is key. And not just with the people who are around you and you're used to, communication with people who think very differently. One of the things that was kind of amazing about this virtual world that I was in is it was an international world. In fact, there were more people outside the US than in the US who participated. And so our students, we did one, they were all environmental pieces, and we had one that was talking about deforestation. And we had people come to the displays from people in areas that were actually having serious problems with deforestation, and they talked about how uncomfortable they were with some of the ways in which the students were putting the displays together. And so they responded to that and adapted their displays to meet that perspective. And I think that can be an incredibly valuable tool, learning to talk to people outside your own group and figure out ways not to tell other people's stories, but to provide a forum where other people can tell their own stories, I think is extremely important.
And I think that collaboration is also something that has been key in thinking about, the skill sets that you look for in students, which I keep telling my theater students, it's a highly employable skill. And so in general, theater students make great hires across the spectrum. But thinking about with institutions, and this was a question that Jonathan had, how museums can build sustainable collaborations for collecting and promoting, especially for the technology field, of that collaboration trickling up to the institutions themselves as we move forward.
Yeah, I wanted It sort of ties to how to get a job as well. What I wanted to say was, I think one thing, I didn't go to a museum studies program, but one thing that I think we're not, isn't often taught in the context of an academic situation or anywhere, is that there's actually a real place for entrepreneurship right now in cultural endeavors. And I say that because all of us here are affiliated with institutions that, in and of themselves are very powerful and hopefully benign, but at the same time, they serve a lot of needs. A lot of different types of missions are encompassed in traditional cultural institutions. So we're not always equipped to, like the mass migration and creation of digital resources, all of these places are capable of handling that, but increasingly the services that we require are contracted and are working with a lot of people who are specialists in, let's say, technology and storage, but don't have the chops to know what it is they're trying to take care of, and that affects how well it can be taken care of. So to think broadly beyond going to a particular institution or staying at a particular institution and saying, what are the needs at this place that I see that the institution can't take care of right now or may not have a good plan for, just going to need a lot of extra help, providing some creative services on the outside, that's not a bad model to pursue if you've got the sort of tenacity to do that. That's not to say there aren't great places within the institutions, but I do think there's an increasing need for third parties that can provide some needed intervention.
That's great. We are in the land of startups, so that's great. Thank you. So I think in our last few minutes here, we have time for just a couple of questions. If anybody from the audience, or if there are any Zoom questions coming in. Yes, in the black hat. What's that?
Can we use a mic out there?
Oh, yes. Do we have, can we grab that one out there? Because I think we only have two. I can also repeat the question. Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. What does the panel think about the significance of something like Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive, and how preserving the Internet as we know it is just as much cultural importance as, say, an artifact in a museum holding?
Yeah, I mean, if we don't, we will sort of as a if we don't attend to that, we're missing most of what's going on, right? So the answer is yes, we need to figure out sustainable ways to be able to capture that history. I don't know if the forums that that will do that well have been invented yet. I don't know how well we're doing that at this point. I think it will only become more important to be able to acknowledge and sort of find a path through this enormous amount of digital materials out there to be able to figure out what it is that we, as let's say, we writ large as cultural stewards and preservation experts, what to collect, how to collect it, and then methods to make that accessible to the future. I mean, that is really where our society happens most often, and if we don't do a good job at all of those things, then we're all in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I would just add to that, sorry, but I think whether or not, again, the tools for current preservation are perfect or not isn't as relevant as that there are some places that are doing it. I'll give you a quick example of one of the reasons it's important. You had mentioned how a lot of times a company will sort of disengage its no longer support their technology just like that. Well, at the public library, because it's going to be a major location for the next census, the library has taken a moment to look at the major security vulnerabilities so that we're not all voting for Russia again. So I think what's going to happen now is I've just spent part of the morning reviewing a number of web properties that I manage that now need to be decommissioned because of primarily the hardware it's on, but also the software. We've been able to save most of the content in other ways, but the sites themselves, we are going to rely on, the Internet Archive and others to do that for us, and we can be a little lax about saving it because someone else is doing it, but we don't necessarily have our own mechanism. So more of that does need to happen.
First off, I'd like to thank you all for your time and for the information that you're bringing to us today. One of the actual things that have been running through my mind since you started talking was SF MoMA's last exhibit, The Theater of the World, Art in China in 1989, where they were dealing with a lot of new ways of displaying art, including having dust from 9/11 spill out a koan on the floor. What, if anything, including the outreach that it took to make that happen, those type of projects happen in 1991, are we looking at today? Have we learned anything from that time period about accessibility and reaching out across cultural lines?
Well, that's a big topic. I mean, that's a great question. I think every exhibit development is a opportunity for us to learn to engage with our communities. And not everyone has looked at it that way in the museum world. So when we're going to do things that are might be perceived to be controversial or stir the pot, we want to be able to be sure that we're doing those with community input, that we have community advisory committees, that we are doing things in ways that are respectful. I'm reminded by the polls that are taken of the public that talk about museums as America's most trusted secular institutions. And this is consistent over the years, more so than schools, more so than the media. But this is a precious gift that we have. So we have a lot to live up to in the museum world, to be able to ensure that we do things with integrity. And more, that means that we must consult with our communities and we must think about the impact of our actions and what we do on the wider public.
I think that is an excellent closing statement, and also I know we're at time. So thank you to our panelists for being here today, and thank you to y'all for coming out on a beautiful Friday morning. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We'll stick around for just a couple minutes if you want to come up and say hello and ask any additional questions. But hopefully you'll take these questions and avenues of conversation into the future of museums. Thank you.